Now here on the Days of Horror podcast YouTube channel, we normally cover stories that have involved a lot of murders, suicides and other atrocities, thus the name Days of Horror. But yet today we're going to take you on a different journey, and we're going to tell you the tale of Wallace Henry Hartley. And for those who may never have heard his name, you will have heard, I presume, the story of the RMS Titanic. The story itself is well known, nicknamed the Unsinkable ship. After having departed Southampton, England on the 10th of April 1912, the Titanic set sail on its maiden voyage to travel to New York City. The ship had contained a mixture of class of passenger, from millionaires and businessmen to the lower class of society who were all eager to begin a new life over in America. But just 5 days into the journey, disaster struck when the ship's starboard side scraped alongside a giant iceberg that had already been reported floating around 400 nautical miles south of the coast of Newfoundland, Canada. The rest, as we know, is history, and the story of the Titanic has been written in many books, as well as turned into movies and documentaries, with some perhaps adding mythology into the mix. And this brings us to the story of a small group of courageous men, and one in particular who have quite rightly become the epitome of the heroics that took place during the frightening and devastating morning on Monday, 15th of April 1912. Wallace Henry Hartley was just 33 years old when he was assigned to become the bandmaster for the Titanic, after having served on other ocean liners such as the RMS Lusitania and the RMS Mauretania. So, Wallace Hartley was the bandmaster on the RMS Titanic, and like I said, I'm not going to go into too much details about the Titanic itself. If you want to know more about the Titanic, just simply search it up on Google and on YouTube, because there's plenty of other channels that have covered the story. But Hartley himself, he was the bandmaster, as I've just said, on the Titanic during its fateful voyage. And today marks the 110th year since the Titanic sank, and it went down during the early hours of April the 15th, 1912, so exactly 110 years ago today. As we all know, the story of the Titanic, how it sank, and like I said, for those that don't know, all you need to do is check it up on Google. But as for Wallace, now he was born and bred here in Colne, and from the age of, I think it was 5, he had this interest in music, and his father himself, Albion Hartley, he was involved in several bands, if you will. He played at several chapels, and he also played in the chapel where Wallace, his body, would be returned not too long after the sinking of the Titanic, at Bethel Chapel on Burnley Road, which is just further in that direction, and we'll take you there shortly. Now, when the Titanic was hit, or the Titanic hit the iceberg, it occurred just prior to midnight on the 14th of April. But it'd take up to 2 hours, if not longer, for it to sink. Now, what we have to appreciate is, and like I said, for those who know the story, it was women and children first on the lifeboats, then probably it was followed by the wealthy, the businessmen, you know, the millionaires of the time. So for the people, especially the males and just your average second-class citizens, unfortunately over 1,500 of them didn't get the chance to get onto a lifeboat. Wallace and 7 fellow musicians were part of those 1,500. Now, as for Wallace and the rest of his band members, they were treated no different than any of the other passengers. Like I said, he wasn't wealthy, he was just an employee. So he didn't have much choice. He had to stay with the Titanic as it was going down. Now, we can only imagine, obviously, the fear, the panic that was running through Wallace's head, as well as obviously his companions. But the remarkable story is that Wallace himself and the rest of the musicians would carry on playing for up to 2 hours while mayhem and panic was happening all around them, while people were screaming and shouting, children crying. The ship was going down, it was sinking, but yet they carried on playing several hymns to try to calm the passengers and the children, you know, especially trying to keep them calm, clear-headed, so they knew where to go and what to do and how to get off the actual ship. But again, you've got to, well, when I say you've got to, you can't, can you? You can't possibly put yourself in the shoes of Wallace and obviously all the other victims who remained on the actual Titanic. It really is such a sad story. Now, one of the songs that he was famous and noted for playing was it was a hymn called Nearer Thy God to Thee. And a lot of survivors who were interviewed by reporters and the press, obviously when they got back to land, many of them recollected hearing that hymn Nearer Thy God to Thee being played by the band during its final moments as of the Titanic descending into the water, into the oceans. But there is a slight twist on that story, and it seems some people weren't fully convinced that is the actual case. Some questioned, would the actual ship be at a wrong angle, and it would have made it too unsteady, and the band couldn't stand, you know, the band members couldn't stand up properly to play instruments. Would the band members have been too frightened and panicky to play instruments? I like to believe, whilst that does make some kind of sense, I like to believe the fact that Wallace, and his grave is now coming up to the side of me, I like to believe that what those witnesses could recollect was exactly that they could hear Nearer Thy God to Thee being played. Now, as I've said, the Titanic would take over 2 hours before it finally succumbed to the mercy of the North Atlantic Ocean. But sadly, it'd take even longer before Wallace's body would be discovered. And it was picked up by the ship, the Mackay Bennett. Now, the Mackay was sent out to obviously help retrieve as many bodies as it possibly could. And a lot of the bodies that were recovered, many of them were so badly disfigured, it could be from the actual disaster itself, or from, I'd probably put the mammals, the fish and that in the sea. But yeah, many of them were wrapped in canvas and then they were buried at sea. But as for Wallace, he was discovered and picked up by the Mackay on April the 30th, some 15 days after the Titanic sank. And what makes it more remarkable is that Wallace himself, at some point before the actual Titanic submerged under the water, he had put his violin inside its suitcase, briefcase, whatever you want to call it, into the satchel, and he put that around his head, around his neck, shoulders, and his body was found floating face up, and he was still clutching at the actual case containing the violin. And the case itself had the initials WHH inscribed onto it. Now we're just coming up to the actual grave of Wallace, and you can see it here. Now you will notice, and I'll point out shortly, but it says, in loving memory of Wallace Henry, the beloved son of Albion and Elizabeth Hartley, formerly of Colne, who lost his life in the SS Titanic disaster on April 15th, 1912, aged 33 years, and was interred on May 18th, 1912. And you can see the plaque, "Nearer, my God, to thee, nearer to thee," which, like I said, was the actual final, or one of the final hymns played on the Titanic during that fateful morning. In front is Bethel Chapel, and it's there where Wallace was brought to, as I've said, in the early hours of May the 18th. He was actually transported from Liverpool from May 17th, where his father, Albion Hartley, awaited his son's body to be returned back to the UK. And like they actually travelled during the late hours of May the 17th and arrived here on May the 18th in the early hours of the morning. And like I said, Wallace's body was placed inside this chapel, and like I said, I'll get more into that shortly. So in the Memorial Gardens you'll find this plaque, the Bethel Church Wallace Hartley Memorial Garden. Now, I'm not going to read it all out because there's quite a lot to read, but there is young Wallace Henry Hartley, born June the 2nd, 1878, sadly died April 15th, 1912. But as you can see, it does detail quite a lot about what happened on the Titanic and the subsequent service when Wallace was brought back here to Colne. Now the church itself, or the chapel itself, as you can see, from 1900 looks completely different to what it does now. And that one was 1857 when it was built. But yeah, this is what it looked like when Wallace was brought back here. There's a photograph of Wallace's violin with the suitcase it was in. And these are the scenes in Colne when Wallace was being taken up to the graveyard. On the day of the service of Wallace's funeral, there was up to 1,000 people inside and outside of the chapel. Inside it was mainly Wallace's family and friends who were witness to the proceedings, and there was many hymns and verses that was read out and that was sung. And obviously you've probably all heard "Nearer Thy God to Thee." Now that itself was actually sang inside the chapel, as well as the actual final resting place or the grave where Wallace was interred. But on the day of the actual interment, if you will, of Wallace, and it all started here back in 1912, and it lasted for just over an hour. And the streets and the paths and the roads all along here, there was up to 30,000 people that all paid their final respects to Wallace. Up to 30,000 people. Some say 40,000, but most certainly there were 30,000 people that all congregated along the streets, all along Burnley Road and up to the distance. A lot of shopkeepers had the blinds closed, a lot of houses had the blinds drawn, and it was all out of mark of respect, because like I said, Wallace was one of Colne's very own sons, if you will. And what we'll do, we'll just take a walk round to the front of the actual chapel now, and I'll give you some more video footage so you can see exactly how it's changed over the years.
Now, we do know that Wallace was a very religious lad. He attended Bethel Church, which is just down the end of Albert Road here. His father was called Albion. He was the choir master of Bethel Church, but also the superintendent of the church as well. It was whilst Wallace attended at Bethel Church, he heard a tune that would stay for him for the rest of his life. "Nearer my God to Thee." Of course, he would go to Sunday school. He would enjoy the sermons, and he saw someone playing a violin. And he asked this person, "Can you please teach me to play the violin?" At the age of 5, he could play that violin quite beautifully. Age of 10, he could play it as good as any adult. His mother and father got very, very concerned about his love for music, and they said, "You should be getting involved with mathematics and English. There's no future in music." So on leaving school here in Colne, his first job was with the Craven and Union Bank, which was situated in the town centre. Apparently he was extremely polite and was an absolute credit to the bank and loved by the people that walked in to see him. However, the family moved from Colne to Huddersfield in 1903, and there he joined the Huddersfield Philharmonic Orchestra. 2 years later, he joined the Bridlington Philharmonic Orchestra. And in 1909, he thought, "I'm a young man, I'd like to see a bit of the world." And he applied for a job with Cunard and worked on Lusitania as a member of the orchestra, the Mauritania and the Lucana. At that period of time, the North Atlantic trade routes were getting very, very busy, and the lucrative tourism routes from England to New York were also very, very lucrative. an organisation called the White Star Line had 3 vessels built at Harland and Wolff in Belfast: the Britannic, the Olympic and the Titanic. And of all these 3 vessels, the Titanic was going to be the queen of the seas. Because of Wallace's excellent record on those 3 vessels, he was invited by Mr. Bruce Ismay to attend a meeting where he was offered the job as the bandmaster on the Queen of the Seas, the RMS Titanic. The local newspaper here in Colne, front page, local lad gets top job. He made his way down to Southampton. He was very, very concerned that day because he had a sweetheart in his life called Maria Robinson. And Maria felt very, very concerned about this particular trip. However, they had a good conversation, and Wallace said, look, it's a very, very good job I've got, and it could lead to even better things. So therefore, he made his way to Southampton. He joined this beautiful vessel, the Queen of the Seas. His cabin had hot and cold water. It was state of the art. He assembled the orchestra as the vessel set out towards Cherbourg, then to Queenstown in the south of Africa, the south of Ireland, and then across the Atlantic Ocean. On the 14th of April 1912, 2 lookouts, Able Seaman Fleet and Able Seaman Lee, were in the crow's nest. There was mist in the air, there was also some sleet and snow in the air, and Fleet suddenly saw this huge iceberg and shouted down the voice pipe to the first officer, Murdoch, who was on the bridge, "Iceberg, dead ahead!" Murdoch put the vessel into full astern and also to starboard. Up in the crow's nest, Fleet and Lee are just watching the iceberg get towards them, and the Titanic slowly was taking evasive action when she collided beneath the waterline, causing extensive damage. The stokers down below are horrified as water comes pumping through the side of the ship, and Captain Smith is very, very concerned for obvious reasons. On board was Mr. Thomas Andrews, the designer of the RMS Titanic. He was invited to the bridge where they had a discussion with all the officers and Captain Smith. Captain Smith was horrified to be told that the damage was so severe they had 1 hour, 40 minutes before this beautiful vessel would end up on the ocean bed. The Titanic sent out distress signals. There were 3 ships in the area: the Californian, the Carpathia and the Nuremberg. The California was only 10 miles away, but unfortunately the radio room was closed down for the night. But the Carpathia picked up the signals, and they were horrified. They could get there, but in 4 hours' time. On board the RMS Titanic, there were not enough lifeboats for the entire passenger list, and indeed the entire crew as well. So therefore Captain Smith organised the evacuation of women and children. This is where Wallace came in. Wallace was about to retire for the evening with the band when he heard about the terrible damage, and he assembled the band on the deck. They played ragtime blues. They played music associated with that period of time. All the time this beautiful vessel is filling full of water. There are many eyewitness accounts, some are rather confusing, but it is said that as the great vessel was about to plunge beneath the waves, they could hear this beautiful tune, "Nearer to my God than thee." It was also said, as the water came over the side of the decking around the band, that Wallace was heard to say the words, "Gentlemen, I bid you farewell." And the great vessel made its way towards the bottom of the ocean. One of the witnesses that day was a young lady from New York called Wendy Slater. She was 21 years old, and she remembered seeing the band assemble, but she also gave an account that Wallace, being a member of the passengers, apparently the crew were all passengers, apparently the bands were all passengers, not members of the crew, and those men could have been saved. However, they were gentlemen to the very, very end, and they decided to play to reduce the panic on board this great vessel. when do you remember the vessel lurch up behind a silvery moon, and you hear the screams of those poor people in the water coming face to face with death? Amongst those screams she heard the tune being played by itself, nearer to my God than thee. And then there was silence. Some 5 days later, a vessel was sent out called the Mackay Bennett from New York. She had a horrible job. Her job was to retrieve bodies. A lookout saw a body on Atlantic swell in evening dress with a violin case strapped to him. The body was brought on board the Mackay Bennett. They looked for the pockets. Wallace Hartley, Colne, Lancashire. His body was brought back here to his beloved town of Colne, and 40,000 people lined the streets as the hearse made its way up Albert Road towards his final resting place. There is a very, very famous saying: if you're a man and you survive the Titanic disaster, then you are classed as a coward. The one thing Wallace Hartley will never ever be is a coward. Not only a great Colne, like the majority of us, but also a Lancastrian hero. And there we have the Wallace Hartley story. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
So it's from here at Colne Cemetery where we'll end this short video on Wallace Hartley. Now, if you did like the story, please don't forget to give us a like, comment and subscribe. Click the little bell for notifications for our future videos, because we're doing more and more regularly now. But in the meantime, as I always say from these places and after these stories, take care, look after yourselves, and we'll be soon back with another tale from our glorious past.